We're all Star Trek fans here, I presume. Some of us disagree on what constitutes Star Trek at its best. Some of us enjoyed Discovery, some of us didn't. Some of us have embraced the Kelvin timeline films, some of us haven't. We have all sorts of differing opinions about favorite episodes, favorite movies, favorite characters, but when you boil it all down, the one thing that we all have in common is that we love Star Trek. Having said that, there is a certain segment of the fan base that I just don't get. And this segment of the fan base has existed for a long time. It seems like it's a lot more vocal now than I can ever remember it being before, but that might just be a result of the internet, which makes it easier to make your voice heard, for better and for worse. I'm talking about the folks who complain that Star Trek has become too politically correct, too heavy-handed, too preachy. And I'm going to explore why I think this is a rather silly idea in this video, which I'm calling, Actually, Star Trek Has Always Been Preachy. The current iteration of this phenomenon usually identifies Star Trek Discovery as the primary offender. Discovery is too politically correct and it's going to destroy the franchise. I get these comments on my videos all the time. And I delete them. Go shit in someone else's yard. Unfortunately, such reactions are easy to find elsewhere. Here's one representative example posted last year to the Star Trek subreddit. Headline: Star Trek Discovery is trying way too hard to be politically correct, and since when do Klingons have different skin colors? Two strong female leads, both obviously from different racial ethnic groups. Seriously? Not that I have issue with either of those, but sheesh. They're insisting they don't have an issue with something while literally in the process of articulating the issue they have with it. Anyway, it goes on. Having them as both captain and the first officer, it just feels like the makers are trying to make a statement. Also, since when do some Klingons have white skin and others have black? I feel like this isn't canon at all. It's a super obvious racial equality thing that is being so forced. Come on, people, we don't need to watch Star Trek to get our political and moral ideas from. Just a quick note on that second objection. Klingons have always been depicted with varying skin tones and have been portrayed by both white and non-white actors throughout the history of the franchise. Plus, it's established in Discovery that Vulk, the albino Klingon character, is an unusual case. And Vulk may not even be the first albino Klingon we've seen. Remember this guy from the DS9 episode Blood Oath? His species is never definitively established. He's only ever referred to as the albino, but he sure looks like he could be a Klingon. When he's depicted in the novel Forged in Fire, he's described as being Klingon. The novel isn't considered canon, but typically the novels aren't allowed to outright violate established canon either. I said typically. Anyway, the albino being Klingon is at least a reasonable conclusion, if not a firmly established fact within the Star Trek universe. Which means that the person who wrote that Reddit post was blaming Discovery for something which had already been an established part of Star Trek for a long time. As I said, this phenomenon isn't new. Discovery is the most popular target right now because it's the new show. Though I have to add that I've seen a few fans expressing misgivings about the upcoming Captain Picard series as well. That series is still in development. As far as I know, there aren't even scripts yet, but already people in this segment of the fanbase are saying things like, the Captain Picard show is gonna suck because it's also by the producers of Discovery, and they'll just turn Picard into an SJW. I mean, I hate to burst your warp bubble, but he wasn't exactly a Tory before. I don't recall too many complaints about political correctness regarding Enterprise, but maybe I missed them. Or maybe people who didn't like that show were too upset by the fact that it was a prequel that supposedly broke canon to notice anything else about it. But I definitely recall complaints of this kind about Voyager and Deep Space Nine when they debuted. When Voyager's cast was announced, and it was revealed that the show would include not only a woman captain, but also a Vulcan played by an African-American actor, there were some people who identified themselves as Star Trek fans, who objected to what they perceived as forced diversity. Since when are some Vulcans black? That's not canon. Sound familiar? Same thing happened when Deep Space Nine was announced and it was revealed that the lead character would be a black man and that the first officer would be a woman. Forced diversity is a complaint I've seen more than a few times about Discovery. It's there in that Reddit post I just read. The person who wrote that post isn't complaining about the writing of the show, or the look, or the tone, or a plot twist they didn't like. It's the mere existence of women of color in prominent roles that provokes the objection. Never mind that it's almost always one of my fellow cis-hetero white men voicing this objection, and that it's pretty much impossible for a white man to complain about too much diversity without sounding racist, probably because it's an inherently racist complaint to make. This is a downright bizarre thing to complain about on a Star Trek show. Diversity, be it in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, culture, or any number of other categories, has been a core component of the Star Trek concept from the very beginning. When the original Star Trek debuted in 1966, the United States was in the midst of some difficult and long overdue changes thanks to many factors, but most prominently the Black civil rights and feminist movements. Black Americans and women were fighting for equality and justice, pushing back against centuries of racism and misogyny that had been ingrained in American culture. When TV viewers tuned into Star Trek, they saw a starship operated by a racially and culturally diverse group of people. The communications officer was a black woman. The lead helm officer was a man of Japanese heritage. And there's even diversity among the characters who are white, or perceived as white, though neither of them play Jewish characters on the show. William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy are both Jewish, and for whatever reason, the concept of whiteness has historically excluded Jewish people. Captain Kirk and Dr. McCoy are Americans. Scotty is Scottish. Chekhov is Russian. In the original pilot episode, the main cast wasn't as racially or ethnically diverse, but the first officer was a woman who was depicted as a strong, no-nonsense intellectual rather than a set decoration. In other words, presenting diversity and inclusion was always an important part of Star Trek. And just in case there are still a few of you who need to be convinced of this, here's the word of God on the subject. Or, in this case, the word of the great bird of the galaxy. Gene Roddenberry once said, "The whole show, meaning Star Trek, was an attempt to say that humanity will reach maturity and wisdom on the day that it begins not just to tolerate, but to take a special delight in differences in ideas and differences in life forms. We tried to say that the worst possible thing that can happen to all of us is for the future to somehow press us into a common mold, where we begin to act and talk and look and think alike. If we cannot learn to actually enjoy those small differences, take a positive delight in those small differences between our own kind here on this planet, then we do not deserve to go out into space and meet the diversity that is almost certainly out there." Despite my problems with Roddenberry as a writer, which I've mentioned once or twice in these videos, he definitely got this bit right. Diversity is a good thing. Diversity is a source of strength. So, when the person who wrote that Reddit thread says of the casting of women of color in prominent roles on Discovery that it feels like the makers are making a statement, they're right. Because making that statement is what Star Trek has always done. It's at the very heart of what the show is about. And it has never exactly been subtle. Star Trek doesn't just model racial and gender and cultural diversity through the example of its cast. It has dramatized the evil and futility and tragedy of racism and other forms of prejudice repeatedly over the last 50 years. It has seldom been more blatant in delivering this message than in the third season classic Trek episode, "Let That Be Your Last Battlefield." The Enterprise encounters a stolen shuttlecraft with failing life support. They rescue the pilot, who turns out to be a man named Lokai. Lokai belongs to a species the Enterprise has never heard of. He has white skin on his right side and black skin on his left side, divided by a straight line down the middle of his body. Shortly after Lokai comes aboard, the Enterprise is visited by someone else with a half-black, half-white skin tone, Commissioner Beale, who explains that Lokai is a criminal on their planet who Beale has been pursuing across the galaxy for 50,000 years, and now that he's caught up to him, no one will stand in the way of his revenge, especially those cocking caped crusaders. I can't help it. Beale speaks about Lokai as though he's a member of a different species than himself, which confuses the crew of the Enterprise, who had assumed Beale and Lokai to be part of the same species. "Are you blind?" Beale asks Kirk. "I'm black on the right side. Lokai is white on the right side. All of his people are white on the right side." Get it? Anyway, Beale accuses Lokai of leading an insurrection and being a threat to the social order, while Lokai insists that Beale and his fellow half-blacks are at fault for having subjugated his people, the half-whites. They ultimately return to their home planet, only to find it totally uninhabited. While they've been chasing each other around the galaxy for the last 50,000 years, it seems their people have wiped each other out. Kirk offers them sanctuary in the Federation, provided they can let go of their mutual hatred, but Lokai and Beale are like, "No thanks, we'll just kill each other," and they beam down to their wasteland of a homeworld to continue fighting. The bridge crew is all like, "What a senseless waste." And Kirk is like, "Yes, their hate was all that mattered to them, and now it's all they have left." As I said, not subtle. Like, I'm pretty sure even Rod Serling would have passed on this script. It's a good message, but I find it to be just a bit too on the nose. Nah, who am I kidding? Rod watched this episode and threw his remote at the TV, pissed off that he didn't think of it. I love you, Rod. Beginning about 20 years after classic Trek, Star Trek The Next Generation produced several shows that deal with the subject of discrimination and the question of who is entitled to basic civil rights. In the second season episode, The Measure of a Man, Captain Picard fights to have android Commander Data recognized as a sentient life form under Federation law. One of the most important scenes is this one between Picard and Guinan, where Guinan draws a line connecting Data's predicament to that of a slave. If Starfleet is allowed to treat Data like property rather than a person, Guinan suggests, then any similar artificially intelligent beings that might be created after him will also be forced to live under those conditions, resulting in, as she puts it, whole generations of disposable people. Picard goes on to passionately argue that it would be a violation of the most basic principles of the Federation to condemn Data and others like him to servitude and slavery, that it isn't acceptable to deprive Data of fundamental rights just because he is different. 2 years later, the final film to feature the original versions of the classic Trek characters, Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, opened in theaters. While that film isn't primarily about racism, it does show us Captain Kirk on the eve of his retirement struggling with the prejudice he feels against Klingons, blaming the entire species for the murder of his son David at the hands of Commander Krug in Star Trek III. Kirk ultimately realizes that he is wrong, that peace between the Federation and the Klingon Empire is worth pursuing, and that he and others like him who harbor antipathy toward the Klingon people will have to change. And just in case there were still a few Star Trek fans who didn't get the point yet, 7 years after Star Trek VI, Deep Space Nine presented an episode that, for the first time in Star Trek history, dealt with racism not allegorically, but directly. That episode is titled Far Beyond the Stars, and finds Captain Sisko experiencing visions of himself as Benny Russell, a science fiction writer living in New York City in the 1950s. Russell creates the character of Ben Sisko, a black man commanding a space station, as a response to the racism he experiences every day, hoping to show the readers of his magazine a better possible future, one where people of all colors can live free from discrimination. Benny sees a young friend of his who looks just like Sisko's son Jake, shot and killed by racist cops, who then brutally beat Benny. When he returns to work, he finds that the publisher has refused to print his story and that he's been fired from the magazine. When Benny reacts to the news by unleashing his long pent-up anger, one of his colleagues, This guy, who looks like Dr. Bashir about to step on stage as Thurston Howell III in a local theater production of Gilligan's Island, tells him to stay calm, and Benny responds, "Calm never got me a damn thing." He collapses to the floor, crying out, "I am a human being, damn it," and insisting that they can scrap his story, but they can never kill the idea of Ben Sisko and what he represents. Now here's the thing. You're entitled to not like any of those episodes. It's all a matter of taste. The Measure of a Man and Far Beyond the Stars are considered by fans and critics to be among the best episodes produced by their respective series, but Let That Be Your Last Battlefield is generally regarded as a bit of a clunker, despite its sadly evergreen moral. But I don't think it's reasonable, given the fact that episodes which argue obviously and intentionally in favor of equality, tolerance, social justice, and progress have always been a part of Star Trek by design, to complain that the newest version, Discovery for the moment, is too preachy or too politically correct. I think such complaints tell us a lot more about the people making them and their inability or unwillingness to examine their own biases than they do about the shows themselves. An entertainment-based equivalent of Douglas Adams's rules for describing our reactions to technology might be useful in understanding why some Star Trek fans react this way. Adams observes that we tend to regard anything that exists when we are born as normal and natural, anything invented between when we're 15 and 35 as new and exciting, and anything invented after we're 35 as against the natural order. So, if you're someone who has made the sort of objections I've been talking about, whatever Star Trek you were first exposed to, be it classic Trek, the movies, TNG, DS9, Voyager, whatever, is probably what you think of as Star Trek the way it's supposed to be. If you dislike more recent versions of Star Trek for being too politically correct or preachy, you're either oblivious to the blatantly progressive political content of the older versions of Star Trek which you enjoy, or you consider that particular political content to be part of Star Trek in its proper state, but you don't want to see it get much more progressive than that. The thing is, if you're not bothered by Uhura and Sulu, or Captain Sisko, or Captain Janeway and Tuvok, there's no reason for you to blame the producers of Discovery for trying to make a statement with the diversity of their cast. They're just doing what producers of Star Trek shows have always done. There are lots of valid reasons to not like Star Trek. There are lots of valid reasons to not like Discovery. But if you love those older Trek shows, yet Discovery seems to be too preachy or too politically correct, please recognize that in that way, Discovery is no different than any of those shows that came before it. Star Trek is about many things, it's true, but one of those things has always been that diversity and inclusion and tolerance and acceptance are good and necessary things, strengths, not weaknesses. When Discovery's producers filled its cast with people of color and women, when they made it the first TV series in the franchise to feature openly gay regular characters, they weren't dishonoring the legacy of Star Trek. They were picking up its proudest tradition and carrying it forward. If you're not able to see that, maybe you should go back and watch some of those older Trek shows again. And pay attention this time. Because if we ever want to realize a future like the one we see depicted in Star Trek, that message is one we all need to get. Hey folks, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Trek Actually. I'm going to let you in on what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be about in just a minute. But first, I have a little bit of housekeeping to take care of in the form of giving shoutouts to my newest $5 per month or more patrons. And they are John Hibbler, thank you John. Unholier Than Thou, thank you Unholier Than Thou. Gregory A. Petro, thank you Gregory. Lawrence Diamond, thank you Lawrence. Nikki Harris, thank you Nikki. Kiera Leach, thank you Kiera. Lee Chapman, thank you, Lee, and Jared A. Deciphe. Thank you, Jared. Thanks to all of you who are my patrons at whatever level you pledge. If you enjoy these Trek Actually videos that I do, or any of the other videos that I do on this channel, and you would like to help me to continue to make them, you can do so by supporting this channel with a monthly donation through Patreon. Just go to www.patreon.com/Steve Shives and you can become a patron for as little as $1 a month. And those $1 a month pledges really help me out. But if you can afford it and you think I'm worth it, you can pledge at higher levels. And if you pledge at $5 a month or more, I will shout out your name at the end of a Trek Actually video to show you my appreciation for not only supporting the channel, but for going a little bit above and beyond. Now, I also want to remind you, another little housekeeping chore I have here is, in addition to doing the Trek Actually videos, I am also the co-host of a Star Trek-themed comedy podcast called The Ensign's Log, and a lot of you have been listening to it and you've been letting us know what you think of it. A lot of you seem to enjoy it, which is awesome. If you have not listened to the Ensign's Log podcast, there are links in the description of this video. You can subscribe through the RSS feed through your favorite podcast app, or you can listen at the website, which is letmelistenpodcasts.com/The Ensign's Log, or soundcloud.com/letmelisten/sets/The Ensign's Log podcast. Those links are all in the description box. Listen in whatever way is best for you. It is a really, really fun show. Myself and my co-host Jason Harding portray characters. We portray ensigns who are sort of faceless, low-ranking officers on a very famous starship that is embarking on a very legendary 5-year mission, and you get to see what our characters are up to sort of in the background or at the same time as the events are transpiring from some classic Star Trek episodes. So it's a lot of fun. It's a really funny show, and we hope that if you haven't listened to it yet and you decide to check it out, that you'll enjoy it. Now, finally, I will be doing this again in a couple of weeks. The topic of the next Trek Actually video will be a character who is such an important part of Star Trek that it's kind of amazing I haven't devoted a whole video just to him yet. So I'm going to do 2 videos in a row about this character, who is perhaps the most important character in all of Star Trek, arguably the lead protagonist of the entire franchise, no matter what generation you're talking about. No other captain has ever really eclipsed this character in the entire history of the franchise, 50 years plus, going strong. I'm, of course, talking about the one and only Captain James Tiberius Kirk. So the next video will be the first of 2 videos in a row about good old Captain Kirk. And I'm not sure exactly what the specific topic will be, but it will be related to Captain Kirk. I have a couple of ideas for what the next 2 videos will be about, but the next 2 videos are going to be Trek Actuallys about Captain Kirk. I hope you're excited. I can't wait to show them to you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you for the first Captain Kirk episode in a couple of weeks.